In episode 52, we featured the case of 20-year-old Irina Yarmolenko. On Monday, May 5th, 2008, Irina, a student at UNC Charlotte, was found dead on the shores of the Catawba River. Surveillance cameras in the area aided investigators in constructing a timeline of events. However, when and why she decided to drive down to the river remains a mystery no one has ever solved. Ultimately, it was determined that Ira had died as a result of asphyxiation secondary to ligature strangulation. At the scene, detectives found 20-year-old herself, partially wet from the river, lying dead with 3 ligatures tightly secured around her neck. Baffled, they began looking for any potential witnesses. They came upon Mark Carver, a local man who was fishing several hundred yards away. Suspicious of Carver's claim that he'd heard nothing when he'd been so close to the crime, investigators zeroed in on him, as well as his cousin Neal Cassada, who had been fishing with Carver earlier in the day. They didn't have a lot of evidence, and the vast majority of what they did have came down to touch DNA found at 3 places on Ira's car, which matched Carver and Cassada. Both men were charged with murder. However, 2 years would pass before either went to trial. Neal Cassada would never see the inside of a courtroom, as he would tragically die as the result of a massive heart attack days before his trial was set to begin, leaving Mark Carver to go before a jury alone. Carver would ultimately be found guilty and sentenced to serve life without the possibility of parole. In June of 2019, 11 years after Ira's death, Carver's conviction was finally overturned, and the district attorney who had originally prosecuted him announced that he would be bringing him to trial yet again, believing full well that Carver was the killer. Now, 3 years later, there has been another major update, which turns this case and the investigation on its head, as all charges against Mark Carver have officially been dropped. This is Trace Evidence Special Case Update: the murder of Irina Yarmolenko. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. This week, we take a look back at the murder of Irina Yarmolenko following the shocking news that all charges against Mark Carver have officially been dropped. Before getting back into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. In 2008, investigators were called to the shores of the Catawba River, where they recovered the body of 20-year-old Irina Yarmolenko. Canvassing the area, they spoke with Mark Carver, a local man who had been fishing just up the river from the crime scene. Suspicious of him, detectives would zero in on Carver as well as his cousin Neal Cassada, ultimately charging them with first-degree murder. While Cassada would pass away before his trial could begin, Carver would be found guilty and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Now, more than a decade later, all charges against Carver have been dropped, leaving many to wonder, did Ira's killer walk free to later kill again? This is Trace Evidence Special Update Episode: the murder of Irina Yarmolenko. On Monday, May 5th, 2008, 20-year-old UNC Charlotte student Irina Yarmolenko was spotted at her Hunt Village apartment on the south side of campus. It was the week of finals, and Ira attended and took one of her final exams that morning, last being seen on campus at approximately 9:45 a.m. She had another exam scheduled for 5 p.m. Surveillance camera footage and financial records show that between 10:17 and 10:21, Ira stopped inside the State Employees Credit Union on University Boulevard near campus, where she deposited some checks. A cash transaction was made, though it has never been confirmed whether Ira was depositing or withdrawing cash at that time. Some articles have specified that Ira made a small deposit, others have said it was a small withdrawal. The credit union was unable to confirm either of these details in a later trial. At 10:33 a.m., Ira arrived at a Goodwill store also located on University Boulevard. Police later clocked the drive from the credit union to the Goodwill store as taking approximately 5 minutes and 50 seconds, which adds some leeway time, as it took Ira 12 minutes to make the same trip. Authorities have, at different points, specified that they believe Ira made additional stops that day, but the timeline exists purely based upon security camera footage, and there were not cameras at other locations. On the video footage from the Goodwill, a male employee approaches Ira's vehicle as she exits. The Goodwill has an outside donation bin which is monitored, and so when the employee approached, Ira handed him some bags and she carried others. In total, 6 bags filled with her personal belongings were given to the store. Among the items donated were a backpack and trash bag filled with soft items believed to have been articles of clothing. Ira also attempted to donate a pillow at that time, but the Goodwill store didn't accept pillow donations, so she is seen on video putting it back in her car. Between 10:33 and 10:50, Ira was spotted at Jackson's Java, a coffee shop where she'd been working since the previous August. Ira had recently resigned since she was going to be moving away. Coworkers have said it wasn't uncommon for Ira to stop by on days off to simply socialize and hang out. The exact timing of her arrival at the shop is estimated based on statements of her coworkers who reported seeing her that morning. Ira is reported to have dropped off some gifts for her former coworkers that morning and then to have lightly discussed her upcoming move to Chapel Hill. At 11:09 a.m., Ira's car was seen via a surveillance camera at the Stowe Family YMCA in Belmont, west of the Catawba River. Video quality was poor, making it difficult for investigators to determine how many people were in the vehicle and whether or not Ira herself was driving. Police later drove from Jackson's Java to the YMCA, alleging that it would have taken Ira only 19 minutes, which they later stated would have placed her arriving exactly when the surveillance footage shows her vehicle, but these details have been disputed, with others saying that the drive from Jackson's Java to the YMCA would have taken a minimum of 30 minutes and possibly as long as 45. It's interesting to note that at the time, 3 sources indicated that Ira had an ex-boyfriend who worked at the YMCA and that she may have stopped there to see him. These accounts are speculative, though investigators did later state that they interviewed the ex and he had been out of state at the time, which they verified through airline ticket purchases. While Ira's ultimate destination is known, the method by which she traveled there following her visit to the YMCA has always been debated. Investigators stated that they believed Ira turned right after exiting the parking lot, heading down a dirt road through the Water's Edge subdivision construction area, driving towards the Catawba River. Others have reported accounts of Ira driving to a Wendy's fast food restaurant and then a Citgo gas station, though these accounts have never been verified. It is interesting to note that a Wendy's bag was later found in Ira's trunk. At approximately 12:40 p.m., an hour and a half after Ira's vehicle was captured on security footage at the YMCA, Dennis Lovelace and Brenda Pierce began jet skiing along the river. The two entered at Dale's Supret on Wilkinson Boulevard and began traveling north via the river. Their 2 accounts of the events have conflicted, with Dennis recounting that as they were going up the river, they spotted Ira's vehicle on the riverbank and immediately proceeded toward it. Brenda Pierce, however, stated that the 2 noticed the vehicle and continued up the river for a while before deciding to go back and check. At this time, they turned around and began heading south, and as they passed Ira's car the second time, they noted that it appeared to have crashed into a tree stump. It was at this time that they noticed a body lying on the ground just a few feet from the car. According to Brenda, they'd been on the water approximately 10 to 15 minutes by this point, making it somewhere between 12:50 and 12:55 p.m. However, by Dennis's account, they'd have been on the river approximately 5 minutes, which would have made it 12:45 p.m. Both Dennis and Brenda agreed that upon spotting the body, they split up and went in separate directions to call for help. The Belmont Police Department received the call at 1:18 p.m., and while dispatching officers, they were also contacted by the Mount Holly Police Department. The area in which the vehicle and body were discovered ultimately fell under the jurisdiction of Mount Holly, but the call ranges in the area varied, which is why the call came into the Belmont Police instead. Both departments responded with officers arriving at nearly the same time, though the Belmont Police would work to assist the Mount Holly officers as it was their investigation. Their arrival is set at approximately 2 p.m. Shortly after setting foot on the scene, a crime scene investigator from the Gaston County Police Department also arrived, as well as members of a rescue team attached to the fire department. When investigators got there, the first thing they noticed was Ira's blue Saturn sedan. The vehicle was crashed into a tree stump not far from the edge of the river. Both doors on the driver's side were open. From their view, the vehicle appeared to have been traveling no more than 15 miles per hour, and the collision had not caused the airbags to deploy. Dirt appeared to have been kicked up under the tires, leading Mount Holly Police Chief David Belk to later suggest that the vehicle had been put in reverse following the crash. Belk later stated, quote, "We can say that the vehicle was running at the edge of the water," end quote. However, conflicting information has also been presented suggesting that the vehicle had been running after impact and that it was in gear, implying that the car hadn't stopped immediately at the time of the crash, and this may have resulted in the dirt getting kicked back up. Investigators would later state that the vehicle had been found in neutral, which has also stirred up controversy as the keys were not in the ignition at the time. It has been pointed out that the 1998 Saturn was a General Motors vehicle which operated under the BTSI system, standing for Brake Transmission Shift Interlock, which means that in order to remove the key from the ignition, the car had to be placed in park. In addition to this, the shifter cannot be moved into the neutral position without inserting the key, starting the car, applying the brake, and then shifting into neutral, which adds a lot of controversy to the actual gear in which the car was found. Ira's keys were found on the ground near her body, and investigators noted that mud had been smeared on the window of the rear driver's side door. The grass around the driver's side door had been reported as being flattened out, suggesting a struggle may have occurred there, though even this point is debated as whether it was flattened out before or after investigators arrived is undetermined. The hood of the car had sustained damage from the accident. There were several items inside the vehicle, including the pillow Ira had attempted to donate earlier in the day and a flowered tote bag from which one of the blue ribbons had been torn off. Lying beside the car, just a few feet away from the driver's side door, was Ira herself. She was found in tall weeds and grass. A circle having a diameter of approximately 6 to 8 feet was knocked down and flattened around her, implying that a struggle had taken place there. She was dressed in a black UNC Pembroke hooded sweatshirt, a black skirt, and brown athletic-type shoes. Ira's hair, skin, and clothing were wet. It should be noted that some articles have stated that her clothing was dry while her hair and body was wet, but it sounds like everything was wet. The earth around her was dry. Ira's head was back towards the embankment, her feet closer to the river under some brush. One of her hands was tightly grasping a reed nearby, which is believed to have been the result of a cadaveric spasm. A cadaveric spasm is an instantaneous rigidity like rigor mortis, but occurs at the moment of death and is actually stronger and stiffer than rigor. This implies that the position Ira was found in was exactly the position she was in at the moment of her death. The cause of her death was quickly noted. There were 3 ligatures around her neck fashioned out of random items. Ira was wearing a hooded sweater, and the string from the hood had been removed and wrapped around her neck, once completely around and the second loop only halfway. The drawstring was knotted several times on the right side of her neck. A bungee cord was also around her neck, crossing over the front of her throat and hooked in the back. Finally, a blue nylon ribbon was wrapped once around her neck and tied with a bow in the front. Later investigation discovered the blue ribbon was actually taken from the tote bag found in the car, and fibers found on her keys suggested that whoever had used the ribbon had actually sawed it using one of Ira's own keys. Also, it was later determined that the ribbon was tied on first, followed by the drawstring, and finally the bungee cord. It was a deeply disturbing scene, and the multiple items used confused investigators. Were a perpetrator attempting to strangle Ira, just one of those items could have been employed. The use of all 3 will lead to many questions later in the investigation. There was some blood found at the scene, though all of it was Ira's. It is believed to have come from her nose as the result of the strangulation. There were also some signs of petechia on Ira's right thigh, indicating that something had impacted her there. While investigators examined the area, bizarrely, They found no footprints near Ira nor at the riverbank, not even her own footprints. A medical examiner never came to the scene of the crime and examined Ira's remains later and was able to view only photographs of the scene. In North Carolina, state law does not require the medical examiner to come to the scene, and in most instances, the examiners elect not to do so. Further examination of Ira, her car, and the scene produced little to assist in determining who may have been responsible or what actually happened. Ira's car interior showed no signs of a struggle. When her trunk was opened, investigators found various items, including a bag from a Wendy's fast food restaurant and a camera. The 35mm camera was advanced 2 exposures, but there was no film inside. At the time, investigators were poring over the scene, and there has been a lot of debate about how the scene was handled. Media quickly picked up on the story, and helicopters arrived, filming down on the investigation. During these videos, later played on local stations, multiple officers can be seen processing the scene without gloves on, touching the vehicle and items surrounding the scene, therefore contaminating the crime scene. Investigators began looking for potential witnesses in the area. The jet skiers were questioned, though they were unable to provide any information about what might have happened. Construction workers operating nearby were also questioned, but they too failed to have heard or seen anything. Police eventually came upon Mark Carver, located approximately 100 yards from the scene of the crime. Carver had previously been spending time with his cousin Neal Cassada, but Neal had left shortly before police had arrived at their location. Investigators would later speak to Cassada. When they came upon Carver, they found him sitting on the tailgate of his SUV and fishing in the Catawba River. Carver was asked whether or not he'd heard or seen anything. He told investigators that he'd heard a scraping sound, which he assumed was related to the nearby construction, but may have actually been in relation to Ira's vehicle hitting the tree stump. He didn't hear any screams for help or signs of a struggle. Carver was asked for identification and provided investigators with his fishing license. One thing which is interesting to note is while Carver and the construction workers didn't hear anything in relation to a crime, they all told police that they heard the jet skiers calling for help. According to Carver, he and his cousin Neal Cassada had arrived at the river at approximately 11:30 that morning, about an hour and a half before Ira's body was found. Cassada is alleged to have left 30 minutes later around 12 p.m., having only stopped by to pick up a salt block for his goats, which was in Carver's possession. After noting his name and address, the officer returned the fishing license to Carver, shook his hand, and went back to the crime scene. Carver left his fishing location at 2:30 p.m. to go and pick up his daughters from school. He returned to the river later that day, hoping to retrieve some fishing nets which he'd left behind, but authorities would not allow him to access the river again. Rumors began to build up before Ira's body had even been removed from the scene. Todd Cloyd, who lived nearby and was working on his home that afternoon, heard the jet skiers calling for help. He eventually grabbed a canoe and rowed towards the scene of the crime, curious as to what was going on. Cloyd later claimed that, upon arriving, he engaged a fellow boater in conversation, and that man told him the first responders had stated it was a suicide. This statement is highly speculative, but news articles would later report that Ira's brother, Pavel, had heard rumors from investigators about suicide being a possibility as well. The suicide theory is a highly controversial avenue in regard to this case and has supporters and detractors on both sides. Ira's family was firmly against this theory, saying that she was happy and was looking forward to attending UNC Chapel Hill. She was uplifted about her future possibilities and at no point displayed any signs of depression. There have been, though, statements made by others which appear to contradict this. Much of what I will present here is speculative, but important in line with this theory. Firstly, 5 people associated with the investigation have alleged through confidentiality that the term suicide appeared in Ira's phone internet search history. Several friends of Ira's from high school also made allegations that she had attempted suicide before and had been hospitalized for hurting herself, as well as having seen a psychiatrist in Monroe, North Carolina for anxiety. It's also been suggested that upon transferring to Chapel Hill, Ira would have moved back in with her parents. And it's been alleged by a college friend that Ira had stated she would kill herself if she had to live under their rules again. This is also highly speculative, and those who have made these statements have elected not to have their names listed, but they are intriguing details to make note of. Some who have investigated this case believe that even the location of Ira's car suggests suicide, as it's possible she may have tried to drive towards the river with the intent of submerging into it, but hit the stump which stopped her. Carver and Cassada would ultimately become the prime suspects investigators focused on. Police had difficulty shaking the two men and found it suspicious that they'd been so close to the scene but heard nothing. They had spoken with Carver and Cassada several times after the murder took place, and in each instance, both men denied being involved or hearing anything. Both Cassada and Carver voluntarily submitted DNA for processing. In addition to this, 5 months after the murder, Cassada took a polygraph and passed. Carver requested that he also be given a polygraph, but investigators elected not to. Both men appeared willing to cooperate and hopeful about clearing their names. While they understood investigators were trying to catch a killer, both began to get the impression that they were being looked at a little more thoroughly than had been implied early on. The police simply kept coming back with more and more questions. During the course of the investigation as it was being handled by the Mount Holly police, the State Bureau of Investigation was utilized to provide assistance, much of which would come from their crime lab, which possessed far more advanced technology and capabilities. Early in December of 2008, 7 months after Ira's murder, a forensic scientist working for the FBI contacted investigators and informed them that she had found matches related to DNA lifted from 3 locations on and inside of Ira's car. All 3 samples contained mixtures of different people's DNA. However, in one spot, the predominant profile appeared to belong to Mark Carver. In 2 other locations, it belonged to Neal Cassada. With this evidence in hand, investigators felt that their instincts about the 2 men had been correct all along. They now had DNA connecting their suspects to the scene, a scene which both men had denied ever going to. One final conversation took place between Carver and investigators, during which time Carver was asked how his DNA could be found on Ira's car if he'd never been to it. Carver explained that there was no way his DNA could possibly have been found there. At one point, an investigator asked, "You want to bet?" To which Carver responded, "I'll bet you $1 million." While Carver was allowed to leave following this line of questioning, a warrant was later obtained, and on December 11, 2008 at 4:30 a.m., both Mark Carver and Neal Cassada were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. Carver was a local, having grown up on family land in Gaston County. Just 5 miles from the Catawba River, 2 roads converge: Carver Drive, named after Mark's father's side of the family, and Nolan Street, named after his mother's side. Carver lived with his father and by all accounts, including his own, was an uneducated man. He grew up farming locally and never finished high school. He was placed in special education classes and dropped out when he was 16, electing to work in a nearby cotton mill. He had difficulty reading and couldn't write, and has defined himself as illiterate. For most people who knew Carver, the word simple was frequently used to describe the man with an IQ of 60. In 2008, when Ira was murdered, Carver was 39 years old and a father to 4 children. His sister-in-law, Robin, when asked about Carver, stated, quote, "He lived for his family and children. He didn't really do much of anything else. Fishing and hunting and family. That was about it." End quote. Carver quit his job at the mill in the 1980s as a result of carpal tunnel syndrome, which made it difficult, if not impossible, for him to continue working. Carver has had multiple surgeries related to that carpal tunnel since the 80s, and complications from one of those surgeries left him partially disabled. Carver has a deficiency when it comes to his hands, giving him little to no grip. Doctor's orders instructed him not to try and lift any items weighing more than 5 pounds. In an interview with reporters from the television news program 2020, Carver unbuttoned his sleeve to show them the surgery scars. When asked to rebutton the shirt, he struggled for several minutes to push just one of those plastic buttons through its slot. District Attorney Locke Bell described both Carver and Cassada as having, quote, "a history of quick-tempered violence." Carver's cousin, Michael Poindexter, disagreed with that assessment, saying, quote, "Mark has never been a bad young'un. Just like anybody else, you come steal from me, I'm coming to see you. But murder? I can't see it. End quote. Poindexter went on to explain that during the period when police were questioning Carver, he encouraged his cousin to hire a lawyer. Poindexter explained that Carver responded, quote, "If I get a lawyer, they're going to think I'm automatically guilty when I'm not." End quote. The evidence which had led to the arrest warrants had seemed enough for investigators, but for prosecutors, they felt the case against the two men was still weak. The DNA which had been used to connect Carver and Cassada to the case was touch DNA located at 3 points. Carver's touch DNA had been found on the outside of the car above the rear driver's side door. Cassada's touch DNA had been located in 2 spots inside the vehicle. For the district attorney, this implied the men had in fact been at the scene that day, but there were other details that didn't make sense. How could the men leave touch DNA on the car, but none on the victim nor any of the ligatures used to commit the murder? One theory was that Carver's DNA was only found on the vehicle because he may have simply been an accomplice, and that following the murder, the men had attempted to push the car into the river. This was odd considering that the keys were nearby, and pushing the car wouldn't have caused enough of an impact to create the damage it sustained. Also, information obtained from the car's black box confirms someone was in the driver's seat when the impact occurred. In addition to that, how could a man with barely any grip strength and another who was winded simply by walking murder an athletic young woman without leaving behind any signs of a fight? For nearly 2 years, there was no movement on the case. Cassada and Carver remained on house arrest, while prosecutors elected not to move forward. Both men were the only suspects in the murder, and for the long duration, police and the district attorney's office worked to bolster their case, but little, if anything, seemed to develop. It was difficult to Ira's family, who felt confused as to why it was taking so long. Charges had been filed, arrests were made, and yet over 2 years had passed since Ira had been murdered, and nothing was happening. Finally, in October of 2010, 22 months after Cassada and Carver had first been arrested, the district attorney's office finally elected to proceed with trials. They severed the cases, choosing to try both men separately. Sadly, Neal Cassada never got the chance to fight his case or to try and clear his name. On Sunday, October 10th, 2010, after reading his morning paper, Cassada excused himself from the table, saying he was going to take a shower. Moments later, he began struggling to breathe and collapsed to the floor. He died almost immediately, suffering a massive heart attack. He was only 55 years old. Cassada's death now left Mark Carver as the sole suspect who would go to trial for the murder of Irina Yarmolenko. District Attorney Locke Bell would contend that Carver had been the aggressor, the primary killer, and only assisted by Cassada. Essentially, Bell argued that Carver and Cassada had gone and attacked Ira. After killing her, Cassada fled the scene while Carver just walked back to his fishing spot and continued with his day like nothing happened. The cornerstone of evidence for the prosecution came down to the DNA. However, in 2010, touch DNA was still very new and difficult for the jury to understand. Not to mention, both Carver and Cassada had spoken to investigators and had shaken their hands before the detectives returned to the crime scene and began processing it without gloves on. While a defense attorney worth their salt would have argued how easily investigators could have transferred the touch DNA due to their improper examination of the scene, Carver's lawyer rested. He called no witnesses, he provided no evidence, he failed to challenge the DNA with an expert of his own. Essentially, Mark Carver's lawyer threw in the towel, leaving his client high and dry. On March 18th, 2011, the jury officially found Mark Carver guilty of first-degree murder. He was ultimately sentenced to serve a term of life without the possibility of parole. While for the prosecution and Ira's family, this was a massive victory, to Carver's family and many in the local community, it was a travesty of justice in which the prosecution had railroaded Carver, charging him with a crime that would have been almost impossible to commit and convicting him on extremely shaky evidence. There were a lot of folks in the local community who fought for Carver's innocence and felt that, so long as he had been convicted, the truth of what really happened to Ira that day would never be revealed. 2 long years later, in March of 2013, Chris Mumma, the executive director of the North Carolina Center on Actual Innocence, agreed to take on Carver's case. Mumma's first actions were to examine the evidence provided during Carver's trial. For her, there were several areas in which she felt evidence had failed to be argued against efficiently, and for which there were several reasons to doubt its validity. In addition to that, Mumma would come to learn that testimony given at the trial was questionable at best and outright perjury at worst. She would take great issue with the turning point testimony of the trial, that of Detective Terry. In Terry's testimony, he stated that while being questioned by the SBI, Carver had claimed to have never seen Ira prior to her death. He referred to her as a little thing and was able to show how tall she was compared to him. Viewing the video of that interrogation shows two distinct truths. At no point does Carver refer to her as little thing. In fact, it's SBI agent David Crow who uses those words. Then, in terms of the height comparison, that happened a little differently too. During the interrogation, Agent Crow told Carver how tall Ira was. He then stood up and, using his own hand, showed how tall Ira would have been against him. He is much taller than Carver, and so he asked Carver to stand and show how tall she would have been against him. Carver does so, using the same height that Agent Crow is showing him. It seems fairly obvious that Carver isn't showing Ira's height by memory, but is simply mimicking Crow's actions. Interestingly, even when mimicking Agent Crow, Carver estimates Ira as being shorter than she actually was. It's also important to note something about this interrogation. Neither the judge nor the jury was ever shown the video. Carver's attorney, had he mounted a defense, could have submitted this video as evidence and made these clarifying points. Judge Kincaid was shown the interrogation video years later during an interview. He was surprised by what he saw and suggested that, had that video been shown during the trial, the results may have been different. Then there was the prosecution's DNA evidence. Unsurprisingly, Mumma found some issues there too. For instance, while the prosecution had argued that only Mark and Cassada's DNA had been found there, that wasn't quite true. Ira's fingernails were found to have an unidentified DNA profile beneath them, which to this day remains unidentified. On the ligatures, neither Carver nor Cassada's DNA was found, but the bungee cord did contain alleles which could not be accounted for. Carver and Cassada had also been excluded in terms of their DNA, as it had not been found on Ira's sweater or skirt. The camera, which the prosecution argued was possibly part of the impetus for the crime, contained no DNA or fingerprints at all. Another area of contention for Mumma was the lack of a defense provided by Carver's first attorney, which had several different facets to it. Outside of not bringing in an expert witness to contradict the DNA testimony, the lawyer hadn't brought in anyone to testify, and there were, in fact, witnesses who had information which would have, at a minimum, provided reasonable doubt as to Carver's guilt. James Beatty saw Mark Carver fishing that day, shortly after police arrived on the scene. While police would have Carver downriver strangling Ira 30 minutes to an hour prior, Beatty's description of Carver that day doesn't exactly fit. Mr. Beatty stated, quote, "We talked about fishing, and we talked about his family. We had good conversations for about 30 to 35 minutes. Mr. Carver wasn't muddy, he wasn't wet, he had no scratches on him. He was just as normal as anybody could be normal." End quote. Based on all these issues, Chris Mumma took the position that Mark Carver should be granted a new trial, throwing out his murder conviction in the process. District Attorney Locke Bell, for his part, argued passionately that they had captured and prosecuted the right man and nothing was going to change his mind. 4 long years would pass before, in January of 2017, Justice Jesse Caldwell III granted an evidentiary hearing to take place in April. Justice David Lee presided over that hearing. There were a lot of issues between the defense and the prosecution, with District Attorney Bell apparently holding back files he had been ordered to turn over to the defense. As of the original episode release, Mumma was fighting to get Carver a new trial. In April of 2019, the evidentiary hearing took place, in which witnesses described Carver's mental and physical disabilities. Others testified about mistakes made during the investigation, and at least one juror from Carver's previous trial filed an affidavit to recant his guilty vote. A DNA expert testified that the evidence used to convict Carver was of low quality samples and would not qualify as a match today. Police Captain Scott Wright testified about a second suspect who was reported to have been seen in the area the day Ira died, though this evidence was never provided to the defense during the first trial. On June 5th, 2019, Judge Christopher Bragg, following consideration of the hearing, made the decision to set aside Carver's conviction and grant a new trial. This decision was made based around bad representation by Carver's lawyer in the original trial, as well as problems with the original touch DNA evidence. District Attorney Locke Bell told the media he would file an appeal and that if necessary, he would prosecute the case again. 6 days later, on June 11th, Carver was released from jail following $100,000 bail, which was paid for by the NCCAI. Carver received GPS monitoring instead of house arrest, allowing him to move freely through the state while being monitored. On July 5th, 2019, Locke Bell filed his official notice to appeal. This was the last development in the case, with the new trial pending following a decision of Bell's appeal, which had not yet been filed. Now, more than 3 years later, there is another major update regarding the case of Mark Carver. Case update. In early August of 2022, the charges against Mark Carver were officially dropped by the district attorney, Travis Page. DA Page quietly filed a motion to drop the charges, writing in his argument, quote, "Upon retesting and re-examination of the physical evidence, there is no longer sufficient DNA evidence to support the charge," end quote. According to the Independent Tribune, Chris Mumma stated that her client had been the victim of an inadequate and biased investigation, also including former District Attorney Locke Bell as having conducted a biased prosecution. When asked about the DA's statement regarding the DNA, Mumma replied that she had been fighting to get the DNA retested since as early as 2014, 8 years ago. She explained to The Independent, saying, quote, "This took far too long, but Mark has his name and innocence back. We hoped from the beginning that there would be an objective and professional investigation to determine the true perpetrator of Ira's murder. They went down the wrong road from the beginning," end quote. Mumma had long argued that the original testing conducted on the touch DNA would not stand up to modern scientific approaches employed by the vast majority of police crime labs today. While more advanced DNA analysis was available at the time of Carver's arrest and conviction, the North Carolina Crime Lab, which had conducted all of the testing, did not employ these newer techniques. While the argument has been made since nearly the beginning that the DNA was insufficient to charge Carver, it took 11 years for the district attorney's office to acknowledge and confirm that information. Apparently, back in 2019, when the conviction was originally overturned, the case was handed back to the district attorney of Gaston County, then Locke Bell, the man who had originally prosecuted Carver. Despite a severe lack of evidence, Bell refused to have the DNA retested and pledged that he would again take Carver to trial, charging him with first-degree murder. However, that trial never came around, and in June of 2021, Bell retired from his position as district attorney, ultimately being replaced by Travis Page. Bell's retirement came just 2 months after his office, in April of 2021, had attempted to have Carver removed from house arrest and sent back to prison to await a new trial. The motion to drop the charges was officially filed on Friday, August 12th, 4 days before Chris Mumma was set to have a hearing calling for the charges against her client to be dropped. Apparently, DA Page had been reviewing the files regarding Carver's trial and Ira's death since January. At the time, he was unsure if there would be another trial, but his priority was to get the DNA retested in order to determine whether or not there was any room to move forward. The DNA was ruled to have been insufficient, not just to retry Carver, but to have ever tried him in the first place. The Gaston County DA's office issued a statement following the charges being dropped and said, in part, quote, Today, upon review of lab analysis, the district attorney's office concludes that the evidence no longer supports the charge of first-degree murder against Mark Bradley Carver nor Neal Leon Cassada. Accordingly, the remaining charge of first-degree murder against Mr. Carver has been dismissed. End quote. Asked about this decision in her defense of Carver, Chris Mumma told WSOC TV9 that while she couldn't discuss the reasons for the dismissal, she did feel it backed up her original claim. Mumma explained, quote, "Our original position had been from the moment we took this case that Mark Carver's DNA was not on anything. If they had used the appropriate standard for testing the DNA, these charges would never have been filed." End quote. Mumma also noted her hope that this dramatic shift in the case might encourage the rest of the state to review DNA evidence in previous cases. She explained to WRAL News, saying, quote, "We hope the resolution of this case will serve as an impetus to motivate the State Crime Lab and Charlotte-Mecklenburg Crime Lab to cooperate in the systematic review of all convictions where DNA mixture analysis was used to secure convictions prior to the lab's adoption of the national standards for mixture interpretation." End quote. Now that Carver is free, there remain a lot of questions to be answered. First and foremost, the original debate about this case is likely to return to the spotlight. Was Irina Yarmolenko murdered that May afternoon in 2008, or is it possible that this was in fact a suicide? In addition to this, if indeed Ira was the victim of a murder, will those responsible be tracked down and charged? Finally, will the DNA discovered beneath Ira's fingernails finally be matched to someone? For their part, the district's attorney's office hasn't revealed a great deal of information about how exactly they plan to proceed. However, on the day the charges were dropped, the DA's office did state that they would not be giving up, saying, quote, "Consistent with our mission and our promise to this community, the Gaston County District Attorney's Office will continue to seek justice for the Yarmolenko family and all homicide victims as the evidence and rule of law permit." End quote. There are, of course, several details which had been ignored during the arrest and trial of Mark Carver, pieces of evidence which many believe might lead investigators down the right path should they choose to pursue them. David Phillips, who had been Neal Cassada's lawyer prior to his unexpected death, told WRAL that a man in Mecklenburg County Jail had confessed to Ira's murder in a letter sent to a local TV station. When investigators went to speak to the man, he refused to answer any questions. It has been noted that this particular man, who has never been named, was 37 years old and was arrested on May 21st, 2 weeks after Irina's murder, and charged with rape. This man allegedly wrote that he and some friends had killed Irina one night after smoking crack, and that the drive for the murder was to rob her and purchase more drugs. According to Phillips, the man wrote that the memories of the murder keep him awake at night. While investigators believe that Irina had to have gone to the lake of her own volition, likely to take pictures for her photography class, evidence suggests she was not alone in the car. DNA evidence shows at least one other person was there, and according to Chris Mumma, evidence also shows that someone had started Irina's car after her death, attempting to free it from where it was stuck. In addition to this, the Charlotte Observer reported that other witnesses in the area at the time told authorities that they had seen a young black male running from the area where Ira's body was found. Witnesses stated that the man was soaking wet and appeared to be carrying a laptop as he fled the scene. Other witnesses stated that they had seen Ira's car being driven by a white male, described as stocky, right around the time leading up to her death. Whether or not these angles will now be pursued more aggressively remains to be seen. Attorney Chris Mumma has stated her personal belief that there is no evidence to suggest that Ira's death was the result of a suicide. Mumma stated that she is willing to give over all of her files to investigators, though she noted that as of this time, no one associated with the investigation has contacted her about obtaining what she and her team have put together. Without giving much detail, Mumma did say that evidence in those files points toward other individuals who may have committed or been involved in covering up the crime. Mark Carver, 43 at the time of his conviction, served 8 years in prison before finally being released when the new trial was ordered in 2019. He then entered 3 years of house arrest, which is finally concluded with the district attorney dropping charges. Today, Mark Carver is 54 years old and has lost more than a decade of his life struggling to overcome the charges against him, charges which in the end, even the DA's office has admitted there was never enough evidence to support. While he's now free, there is nothing that can be done to give him back those lost years, nor to redeem his reputation in the community. For him, life will go on as best it can, but for the Yarmolenko family, they now return to the horror of unknowing. On the day his ankle monitor was removed, Carver was too emotional to speak to reporters. Carver family spokesperson Robin Carver did, however, speak, saying, quote, "We're happy it's finally over. It's been a long time coming. We just hope her family gets justice. We know someone is still out there, and they are guilty." End quote. Investigators and the DA's office worked hard, so hard to prove to the Yarmolenkos that they had charged the right man. They argued that Carver had committed the murder. The evidence supported this, and they had no doubts that he was responsible. For the past 11 years, the Yarmolenko family have supported investigators and argued against any possibility that Carver could have been improperly convicted, or worse yet, innocent altogether. There haven't been any statements from the family since the announcement that the charges were dropped. I can't begin to imagine what it must be like for them to tear open this old wound, to revisit the pain, and more than a decade later, to return to a place where they aren't sure what happened or who was responsible. I sincerely hope for the Yarmolenko family and for Ira herself that investigators will work hard to investigate this case as thoroughly and accurately as they should have back in 2008. If indeed Ira was the victim of a homicide, as many do believe, and rightfully so, that means the person or persons responsible were free to walk away from the crime and likely to commit others. We can only hope that, sooner than later, justice will be found, and the people who stole away a bright, talented young woman's life will finally pay for their horrible act. Now, however, with Mark Carver erased from the picture, new detectives will inherit a flawed and confusing investigation 14 years after the fact. Hopefully, they'll be able to discover something that was missed, perhaps a suspect that was ignored or overlooked. It's time to test the DNA under Ira's fingernails. It's time to work the case the way it should have been handled from day one, because without hard work, new evidence, and the discovery of new information, the murder of Irina Yarmolenko will remain open, unsolved, and quickly growing cold. "14 long years have passed since the day Irina Yarmolenko was found along the shore of the Catawba River. For the vast majority of that time, investigators were focused in on Mark Carver and Neal Cassada. Now, all these years later, the slate has been wiped clean and detectives must start from square one. Irina's case is one that's always bothered me, and while I know the summary of the details today was much longer than most updates I release, this case is just so complicated with so many different moving parts, I couldn't even touch on all of it. If you haven't yet, I highly recommend you check out episode 52, The Murder of Irina Yarmolenko, to hear the full story as best we know it. I will continue to follow this case, and I hope we'll do additional episodes in the future as the investigation continues to develop. I sincerely believe that Ira's killer is still out there somewhere, and 14 years is far too long to get away with murder. However, if they're ever going to crack this case, they're going to need your help. If you have any information about the murder of Irina Yarmolenko, please contact the Mount Holly Police Department at 704-827-4343. You can also contact the State Bureau of Investigation at 919-662-4500. In addition, you can contact Charlotte Crime Stoppers, where you can report information anonymously by calling 704-334-1600. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our very amazing Patreon producers. Thank you to Alicia Townsend, Amy Guthrie, Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Brittany Bivens, Christine Greco, Denise Dingsdale, Donna Buttram, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Eloanne Meyer, Fabulous TT, Greg, Guillermo Pinto, Haley Christie, James, Jennifer Winkler, Jill Sense, Joni Berkowitz, Julie Mangano, Kara Moreland, Lars Jensen Fengel, Leslie B., Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Quinn McBreen, Sarah Lyons, Susie the Cutie, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tiffany Nelson, Tom Archer, and Tom Radford. Thank you so much for your amazing support. Without you, this show would not be possible. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This concludes today's update on the murder of Irina Yarmolenko. I know this is a controversial case for a lot of folks, and as much as I personally believe that Mark Carver was innocent, others believe he is very guilty. In so much as the evidence can show, as the case currently stands, there is nothing which links Mark Carver to the death of Irina Yarmolenko. Now, we will wait and see what happens next. Someone out there knows the truth. Someone out there holds the power to end the Yarmolenko family's years of suffering. It might even be you. So make sure you reach out, contact police if you know anything, even if you don't think it's important. You never know what little piece of information could change anything. I want to thank you all again for listening. Your support of the show means the world to me. I'm going to be taking next week off. I'm traveling out of town on business, but the show will return with another unsolved case on Thursday, September 8th, and I hope to see you then.